been reported that a DoD watchdog will evaluate how the Pentagon has handled reports of UFOs. This after the Defense Department confirmed these now viral leaked videos.
In-depth analysis of the government's past approach to UFOs is laid out in by the New Yorker's Gideon Lewis-Kraus. It finds agencies have not come clean about the UAP phenomenon. So the staff writer at the New Yorker, Gideon Lewis-Kraus, he joins us now to discuss. Gideon, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So just tell us a little bit about, first of all, maybe what inspired you to write this piece, some of the more interesting parts that you uncovered in your analysis of the Pentagon's treatment of the UFO phenomenon over the years.
Well, to me, the interesting thing was why all of a sudden have UFOs become something that are reputable to talk about in public in a way that certainly for my lifetime, they were relegated to the fringe. And then it seemed to me that pretty much overnight, a couple of years ago, this became a popular subject of normal conversation. The question was, why did that happen and how?
Mm-hmm. And so what did you find on that front? What was sort of the spark? And what have we learned since this conversation has gone mainstream?
Well, the spark clearly was the publication in December of 2017 of a long New York Times article unveiling the existence of a Pentagon program that had been looking into UFOs between initially 2007 and 2012, and then as part of an unfunded program that continued after 2012. And this became, these revelations sparked such widespread fascination with this that all of a sudden it was taken seriously on Capitol Hill in a new way. And eventually there was legislation that directed the Pentagon to look into this. Now, to me, one of the most interesting things that I found about this was that actually the real historical anomaly was that we didn't talk about UFOs since 1970 or so. That one of the things I found is that between 1947 and 1970, UFOs were a regular subject of conversation. They were on the cover of magazines. They were on TV. It was debated in public and press conferences.
So, Gideon, who was responsible for changing that? I mean, was it the Pentagon's lack of transparency around what was happening? Was it an explicit directive to try and cover up what was happening? Because popular culture largely followed ridicule as a result of government policy. Am I wrong?
Right. So in the late 60s, there was a commission that was funded to look into the reality of UFOs. And the whole thing was a fait accompli from the beginning. The director of the commission was a physicist who had told audiences that he thought the whole subject was bunk. And this report comes out in the fall of 1968 and basically says there's nothing to see here. The weird thing about the report, which was about 1,000 pages long, is that it seemed like the man who had directed the report and who wrote the summaries and the conclusions had only a glancing familiarity with the rest of the report, in which roughly 30% of the cases they investigated had, no clear resolution. Mm-hmm. But what it did was it licensed people in the media and in government to say, look, there was this report, there was nothing there. So it became just the subject of ridicule since 1970 until the revelations that the Pentagon had, in fact, been taking these seriously, since at least 2007, if not before. We certainly don't know about before.
Yeah.
And what do we know about what the government knows at this point?
That is a very good question. And there are lots of conflicting accounts. I mean, certainly the people who had been involved in this program say that there's a lot of material there. And we've seen these 3 videos that had been released under somewhat murky circumstances and given to the Times, that the Pentagon came out and said, yes, these are ours. We're going to authenticate them. And yes, as the Navy said in September of 2019, they contain things that we consider unidentified. And it was the first time in a very long time that anybody in that kind of position of power had said, yep, it's unidentified. We don't know what these are. But they didn't say more. And so since then, there have been other leaks. There was the pyramid video that you showed, although there's good reason to believe that that was just a lens artifact at this point.
Mm-hmm. And so that's really the thing I wanted to get to, Gideon. What do people inside the Pentagon think that these things are? So there's a lot of discussion online. There's like Mick West, there's like the debunking people. There are people who are all in on the extraterrestrials. There's the drones explanation. What do the actual people in charge think?
So certainly some of them had been criticized, and in the article I quote from one of the debunkers who says, look, these are just regular people. It's a fantasy to believe that people in the government somehow are immune from unreasonable beliefs. And they have the same unreasonable beliefs the rest of us do. And some of them are just UFO fans who watch the History Channel. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure that's true of some of these people. But the Pentagon people that I talked to, the people who certainly did not want their names included and did not want attention for this, said, look, it's very possible that this is some kind of low rent technology like drones that have been kind of dressed up in mysterious ways, and they could, either are being used by our adversaries or potentially non-state actors. And the most important thing is that we remove the stigma surrounding reporting unidentified things in the sky, just so we know, just so we can figure out what's going on here. But, what they said to me was, it's possible that that is not the case also. That we have not ruled out other explanations. We're certain, as one person said to me, like, he's going to sleep fine at night if it turns out that these were just funny quadcopters all along, especially if it changes the bureaucracy for how things are reported. But he also said, some of this stuff we just don't know. I mean, he was very honest about that with me.
Yeah, and so who are some of the key Washington or other political players who've been pushing forward these lines of inquiry?
So the two people who really drove the New York Times revelations were a man named Lou Elizondo, who had been running this Pentagon program called ATIP, and then had been running it on his own as just part of his portfolio. And he publicly resigned with a scathing letter to former Secretary of Defense Mattis in October of 2017. And before he had left his job, he had secured the release of these videos. The other figure was a guy named Christopher Mellon, who was a former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And he, too, had a longstanding interest in these things. And the two of them together, along with some other people, had gone to a woman named Leslie Kean, who was a longtime reporter about UFOs. She'd been working on the topic for 20 years and had been very careful to associate herself with the closest that these kinds of paranormal investigations get to, science adjacent. So she really had studied, for the most part, just military encounters, commercial pilots, like cases in which there was real data. Mm-hmm. And so she had a reputation for being a very sober reporter on the subject. And they had come to her and said, look, we couldn't get anywhere at the Pentagon. We were banging our head against the wall. Mattis wouldn't see us. And we think this is important enough that we're going to come out publicly. And she brought all that stuff to the Times.
That's really fascinating. And I'm glad you're answering the question of finally, why now? But maybe put a pin in it, because a lot of people, I've heard it put this way. There's three explanations. One is it's drones or some other unexplainable Earth-like phenomenon. One is it's aliens. The other one is that it's all made up by the Pentagon in order to justify more money for the Space Force. All three sound pretty interesting to me. Yeah.
What people said to me was the last explanation is the silly one. They said to me, look, if we wanted more money for stuff, there are much easier ways to get more money for stuff.
Okay, good. So I'm glad you could at least put that one to bed. Gideon, really appreciate you joining us, man. I hope that everybody goes and checks out the article. It's one of the best mainstream pieces I've seen on this in a long time. So thank you.
Yeah, great to have you, Gideon. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.